So again, thank you all for being here. We're going to start off today's program with the first of our two keynote presentations. And the first presentation will be from Dr. Rudolf Bernet, who certainly needs no introduction here. And he is going to be speaking on Husserl on imagining what is unreal, quasi-real, possibly real, and irreal. So Dr. Braunbaum is passing out the handout. And without further ado then, Dr. Bernet.
Okay, thank you so much for having me come here, Deborah, especially Gina. It's a pleasure, and it has been a pleasure already yesterday. I'm not sure I have been invited as a representative of the new generation, so one wonders what the old generation, what the new generation expects from the old generations. Maybe some kind of blessing from the blind fathers. But I would say the true blessing that makes us come here together is certainly Husserl's thoughts. And one of the blessings of Husserl's thoughts, I think, is that Husserl scholars tend to be rather friendly with each other. So maybe we should add a new category to Gadamer's Rezeptionsgeschichte, those philosophers whose scholars are friends and those philosophers whose scholars are not friends. Certainly Husserl belongs, together probably with Merleau-Ponty, is one of the few examples where most people studying his thought have become naturally friends. Interesting question why this is so. One can also enjoy a blessing without asking why. Let me then begin. The analysis of imagining consciousness occupies a central place in Husserl's exploration of the different forms and modalities of intentional consciousness. Retracing Husserl's footsteps, we will explore the essential difference between acts of pure fantasy or quasi-perception and acts which represent an object by means of an image or a sign, without losing view of everything that separates the intuitive givenness of an imaginary object from the perceptive givenness of a real object. We will also pay attention to how the imaginative representation, Vergegenwärtigung, of an unreal intentional object differs from remembering the real object of a past experience. It will soon appear, however, that the opposition between objects that really exist and objects that have no real existence is insufficient to fully account for the nature of acts of imagination and their intentional objects. Imagined unreal or fictional objects can indeed also be objects of a possible real experience. Imagined objects can possibly become real objects and then lend themselves to an actual perception. For this, the content of imagination must comply with both objective and subjective conditions of possibility. Only when these conditions are fulfilled can the possibility for an imagined object to become a real object be realized and merit the name of a real possibility. On the other hand, it is because they are not taken to really exist that objects of imagination lend themselves to an insight into the essential constituents of a certain type of object. For Husserl, an essence concerns what real and unreal objects of a certain kind necessarily have in common. As such, an essence has a kind of ideal existence that operates as a condition of possibility for all real and unreal and individual objects of its kind. Essential Essences or essential laws thus concern the ideal possibility of objects and of their experience. Despite being unreal in the sense of an empirical, mundane reality, essences and other kinds of ideal objects have a reality of their own, which Husserl calls irreal. Thus, in addition to the central role it plays in Husserl's theory of intentional consciousness, the phenomenology of imagination also participates in his phenomenological investigation of the logical and ontological and model categories of reality, unreality, irreality, possibility, impossibility, and necessity, contingency. No wonder, then, that Husserl's analysis of imagination has a central impact on his entire philosophical project. This is already true for the phenomenological method, whose most essential moments, such as the epoché, the transcendental reduction, and the eidetic reduction, are most closely related to the refraining from positing the real existence of empirical objects. The rupture with the course of natural life, the attention to the essence of a thing independently of its empirical context, the discovery of how the givenness of a thing depends on how it is subjectively intended, these are fundamental insights that phenomenology largely owes to its description of imagination. Imagination or fiction thus becomes, in Husserl's own words, the vital elements of phenomenology, and in particular of a phenomenological analysis of intentional consciousness. In what follows, I will also pay attention to how imagination leads Husserl to refine his analysis of inner consciousness of different kinds of intentional acts, and how, in imagination, intentional consciousness divides itself into separate modes of life through a scission of the ego or subject of experience. And now you can look at the handout: pure fantasy, imagination without signs or images. With each of the two major transformations in Husserl's conception of imagining consciousness, there is a deepening and enriching of his understanding of the imaginary modes of the presence of an object. This also entails a transformation of Husserl's phenomenological understanding of both the perceptual presence of an object and of its symbolically signified presence. In distancing himself from the understanding of imagination as an improper representation in the Brentanian sense of the term, the first transformation establishes the nature of imagination once and for all as an intuitive and sensuous form of intentional consciousness. The imaginary, in the sense of acts of fantasy, is that cut loose from a mathematical conception of the imaginary. The radical separation between the intuitive imagination or fantasy and signifying acts will also mean, quite notably, that the givenness of the improperly or emptily appearing moments of a perceived external object will no longer be confused, as was still the case in the logical investigations, where the subjective representation by means of a sign or a signative partial intention. Husserl was soon to realize that such an improper mode of appearance, uneigentliche Erscheinung, within an act of perception is neither a matter of imagination. The second transformation of Husserl's conception of imagination has to do with the discovery of a new form of difference, which this time exclusively concerns representing consciousness itself. When elaborating his new analysis of pure fantasy, Husserl introduces a radical distinction between acts of imagination which represent an absent object by means of an image, and acts of pure fantasy which involve, on the contrary, a reproductive doubling of intentional consciousness itself. We will see that this new and updated theory of pure fantasy as a neutralized or non-positional representation goes together with a remarkably deepened understanding of remembering as the other form of an intuitive representation of self-given intentional objects. The new analysis of pure fantasy will also have a decisive influence on the analysis of an aesthetic perception or perceptual fantasy, and on the analysis of a representation of someone else's mental life. This last involves a representation more analogizing than reproductive, which nonetheless must be radically distinguished from an analogy grounded in the presence of an image. Second, the neutralization of reality in pure and perceptual fantasies. Husserl's pure fantasy is a form of imagination that is cleared of any contamination by reality, even by the reality of an image, external or mental. It is thus a matter of an intuitive consciousness which freely produces or creates, by dint of its invention, fictive objects and imaginary worlds. As is clearly shown by the example of fantastic tales and mythological stories, such fictive objects and worlds can have their own form of coherence. They are the products of a consciousness or an attitude sui generis, which is distinguished not only from the perceptions in the real life, but also from what Husserl calls perceptual fantasies. A perceptual fantasy consists in seeing something unreal, which is to say, having no actual existence. For example, seeing King Lear on the stage. If such a perceptual fantasy seems to be related to some sort of illusion, the same certainly cannot be said for pure fantasy or imagining fantasy. One must thus clarify the intuitive, but not perceptual character of pure fantasy, as well as the neutralized positing of the existence of its objects, which makes all the difference with perceptual illusions. This presupposes a better understanding not only of the different sorts of conflicts or incompatibilities which characterize, respectively, pure fantasy, perceptual fantasy, and illusionary perception, but also a better understanding of the distinction between an illusory semblance and an imaginary semblance. According to the most commonly accepted conception, an illusion is a false perception. It consists, for example, in perceiving a real person, when in truth there is only a mannequin before me. For me to realize after the fact that what I had taken for a perception was an illusion, I must have a new, more correct perception of the object. Once unmasked as an illusion, the former perception ceases to be so much. I can no longer believe either in the object's presence in flesh and bone, leibhaft, or in its actual existence. What prevents me from this is precisely the perceptual givenness of a new, truly existing object. As soon as I come to see this human form, that this human form is in reality a wax figure, I can no longer perceive it as being a real person. The former illusory perception does not for all that disappear from my consciousness. Rather, it is preserved as an illusion, or as Husserl says, under the form of a crossed-out perception. A perceptual fantasy cannot be an illusionary perception for the simple reason that it does not pretend to be the perception of a real object. An adult spectator never believes that what he sees on stage is the real King Lear. He never perceives him as he perceives the attractive lady in the first row of the side balcony. However, he also does not perceive the actor independently of his playing King Lear. The spectator, as Husserl says, rather sees Lear in the actor, or the actor as Lear. Consequently, the actor and King Lear are too interdependent and too mixed up with each other to allow for any perceptual conflict between them. It is true that when the acting is good and the fictional drama sufficiently compelling, the spectator completely forgets about the actor and only sees or quasi-perceives Lear and his daughters. However, this will not make him totally ignorant of the unreal character of what he perceives on stage. Even when he loses all interest in the acting of the actor and pays no attention to the surrounding reality, he will not stand up and physically interact with King Lear. A perceptual fantasy is not an illusion in the common sense of the word. It is rather a fiction made visible, and not a perceptual reality becoming unreal because of a perceptual conflict. In both a pure fantasy and a perceptual fantasy, the neutralizing modification of the positing of the existence of the intentional object is not imposed on the subject from the outside by an external conflict affecting the appearing objects. The absence of belief or neutralizing modification of the existence of an imaginary object results, on the contrary, from an attitude freely adopted by the subject. In true acts of fantasy, the subject deliberately disengages itself from the intercourse with real objects and with the real world. As Husserl's term neutralization suggests, a subject that does not believe in the real existence of the imaginary objects also does not believe in its unreality or non-existence. In the particular case of a perceptual fantasy, under the form of an aesthetic contemplation, for example, of a painting, the will to carefully separate what in the intentional object is real and what is unreal would actually be out of order and mistaken. Losing interest in the difference between the real and the unreal, this is how an aesthetic attitude distinguishes itself from a naturally realistic attitude. Showing its indifference to that difference, this is a mode of appearing of an imaginary object under the form of an aesthetic semblance. For Husserl, all fantasy is the product of an act of subjective freedom and conscious choice. Even in a perceptual fantasy, it is the subject who suspends belief in the existence of what it perceives and who decides how to perceive it. It is true that this inhibition of belief is often motivated by the vague, changing, or incoherent manner in which a fictional object is presented in the real world. But this is insufficient to explain why, from the beginning, the subject never fully believed in the reality of what it saw. This is even more true in the case of pure fantasy. The freedom of this act can thus be said to be absolute, in the sense that it cannot, in principle, be motivated by any kind of perceptual appearance. Even though the imagination of fictive objects, such as a centaur, often makes use of elements drawn from the perceptual reality, one cannot say, of course, that the perception of a real man and of a horse is what motivates the imaginary representation of a fictive object. Perceptual fantasies and pure fantasies differ in their neutralization of the existence of their imaginary intentional object. In perceptual fantasy, the modification of neutrality concerns the perceptual consciousness, which is to say, an act of perception that is actually experienced. By contrast, when I imagine a centaur in an act of pure fantasy, there is no actual perception involved that could be neutralized. The intuitive givenness of the centaur, far from involving the modification of an actual perception, is rather a givenness that I give to myself. It is one that I create in freely producing the imaginary representation of the centaur. The way in which this centaur is intuitively given to me in an act of pure fantasy involves no real object, the existence of which could or should be neutralized. This is actually why Husserl in the 1920s will cease to use the term neutralization to characterize the absence of a doxic positing concerning the object of pure fantasy. This makes pure fantasy not only a less ambiguous act than perceptual fantasy, but also a more positively productive one, liberated from the concern to distinguish itself from any kind of actual perception. A pure fantasy is not only more free, but also more open and creative. 3, pure fantasy and memory. How then does consciousness go about freely and creatively producing the fictive objects that are given in a pure fantasy or quasi-perception? The main difficulty stems from the fact that pure fantasy is an act of intuitive representation involving neither the modification of a present actual perception, as is in the case for a perceptual fantasy, nor the reproduction of a past actual perception, as is in the case of remembering. Even if pure fantasy shares with perceptual fantasy the fictional character of its intentional object, and with an act of remembering its reproductive character. Accordingly, one should say that pure fantasy is a reproductive form of consciousness which intuitively represents an object whose unreality has the form of a fictive existence. What pleads in favor of understanding pure fantasy as a kind of reproductive consciousness is, I think, its similarity with an act of remembering. Instead of perceptually presenting a present object, an act of pure fantasy, like remembering, intuitively represents a physically absent object. For Husserl, this intuitive presence of an absent object is the result, for both pure fantasy and remembering, of a present act of representation, intentional involving or implicating an implicit act of perception. When one remembers a past object, it is presently given as having been experienced in the past. Because it is presently remembered as past, the intentional object of memory cannot be perceived, not even perceived again. Remembering is thus different from a present repetition of a former perception. However, as an intuitive act of memory, the object represented is itself truly given as past. Remembering is thus an act of intuitive representation, where representation means the implication of the former perception of a formerly present object. It is not a representation of a past object by means of a present perception of a present image or sign. Husserl calls the mode in which a former perception is implicated in the present memory of a past object reproduction. Likewise, the manner in which a pure fantasy intuitively represents its imaginary objects involves no presently perceived present image or sign. Husserl concludes from this that, just as in the case of an act of remembering, it must represent its object by means of an implicated imaginary perception. He also claims that this implication of an imaginary perception must be understood in terms of a reproductive consciousness. Pure fantasy and intuitive remembering must thus be intentional acts of an intuitive representation of an intentional object that involve the reproduction of an intuitive presentation or perception. There is, however, an important difference between a pure intuitive fantasy and an intuitive memory. Memory believes in the existence of the object of the reproduced perception. Fantasy does not. Memory also involves the reproduction of a past real perception. Fantasy involves the reproduction of a present imaginary perception. For Husserl, this difference manifests itself most fundamentally in the way in which the reproduced act of perception is experienced in the inner consciousness of the subjects. In a pure fantasy, it is experienced as an unreal perception or as a quasi-perception. The singular mode of this quasi is the expression of the facts that the implicated perception of the imaginary object is not an actual perception of a real object and never has been one in the past. Stated otherwise, the quasi-perception of the fictive object is the modification of an implicit perception that has never actually taken place before being reproduced and modified. In contrast to remembering, it is thus a matter of a reproduction producing the quasi-perception it reproduces. This operation, at once paradoxical and mysterious, becomes fully comprehensible only with the help of Husserl's theory of inner consciousness. Inner consciousness. According to Husserl's theory of temporal inner consciousness, the actual accomplishment of every act, regardless whether it is an act of presentation or an act of representation, is necessarily accompanied by an implicit impressional awareness, which Husserl, after Brentano, calls an inner consciousness. It goes without saying that pure fantasy, like remembering, is such an actually accomplished act, and that as such it must be impressionally experienced by the inner consciousness of an imagining subject. This cannot be the case for the imaginary perception reproductively implicated in the acts of a pure fantasy. Unlike the real acts of a pure fantasy, the implicated imaginary perception is not really or straightforwardly affected and never has been so. The mode in which the latter is experienced by the inner consciousness can thus not be impressional. One should then say that what inner consciousness experiences is the effectuation of an act of pure fantasy. One should then say that what inner consciousness experiences in the effectuation of an act of pure fantasy is the actual accomplishment of an intentional act, which reproduces the act of an imaginary perception, whose represented intentional object belongs not to the real world, but to a fictive world. Put differently, the inner consciousness of the effectuation of an act of pure fantasy is the experience of a doubling of intentional consciousness. In an act of pure fantasy, this doubling of intentional consciousness amounts to a veritable form of scission in subjective life, because the imagining intentional act and the imagined intentional acts have a wholly different nature. This is not so in remembering, where the reproductive present intentional acts and the reproduced past intentional acts belong to distinct moments in one and the same actual stream of consciousness, the unity of which is attested by the continuity of an entirely impressional inner consciousness. In a pure fantasy, on the contrary, the intentional acts of reproductive representation is impressionally experienced by the subject, while the quasi-perception which it reproduces is not and it has never been. An intentional act that is not impressionally experienced in inner consciousness is, as it were, experienced at a distance. The quasi of the quasi-perception involved in an act of pure fantasy would thus not only relate to its lack of belief in the existence of the imagined object, but also to the marginal place such imaginary perceptions occupy in the real life of a subject. 5. The quasi-reality of imaginary subjective lives in imaginary objective worlds. This marginalization in the real life of a subject of quasi-perception and of their fictive quasi-objects does not exclude different quasi-perceptions imagined by a subject or by a community of subjects from becoming interwoven with each other in such a way as to form a coherent and enduring unity of one imaginary life. The intentional correlate of such a unified imaginary life lies in the unity of meaning and duration of one fictive quasi-world or fantasy world. This fantasy world is a world made up with the intentional fiction objects of the imaginary life of an imaginary subject, Husserl calls fantasy ego, who participates in this world in the capacity of a spectator or as the capacity of an actor, or very often both. This fantasy ego, unlike the real ego who actually entertains the fantasies, the fantasy ego does not have any reason in himself for not believing in the existence of his imaginary worlds. One could thus say that within one and the same subject, the unity of parallel lives come to be knitted together, where the life of a fantasy ego in its fantasy world forms a sort of simulacrum or imaginary replica of the actual life of the real ego, such as it takes place in the real world. Fantasizing belongs to the actual life of the real ego. This is why past acts of fantasy can be remembered in the same way as one remembers one's past acts of an actual perception. It is only the content of a fantasy, the fantasized perceptions of a fantasy ego living in a fantasy world, that remain irremovably separated from the real life of the real ego in the real world. In contrast to the continuity of the real life of the real ego in the real world, a fantasy ego and its fictive world last only as long as a particular fantasy endures, as, for example, one that stages a particular myth or fairy tale. We are also not entitled to think that the life of one fantasy ego in its particular fantasy world could join up with the life of another fantasy ego in another imaginary world in such a way as to form a unity of one fictive life in a common imaginary world. There is no more of a community between imaginary worlds than there is between different fantasy egos. Nothing justifies thinking that the world in which centaurs wreak havoc and the one in which Snow White sleeps her mortal slumber would form one and the same imaginary world. Each fantasy ego is, on the contrary, a prisoner of his own particular fantasy world, and there are as many imaginary worlds as there are fantasy egos. Yet, since it is nevertheless the same person who simultaneously lives in the real worlds and in fictive worlds, one must conclude that a human person can simultaneously lead a double life, an actual life and an imaginary one. These two forms of life, despite all their essential difference, are not totally separated, because all imaginary lives and their diverse fantasy egos are still the products of real acts of intuitive fantasy accomplished by a real ego. The fictive life of a particular fantasy ego is thus, for a certain lapse of time, superimposed upon the actual life of the real ego. Put differently, the fragments or episodes of the multiple imaginary lives, of the multiple imaginary fictive subjects, imagined by a single subject, remain anchored in the fabric of its real life. This anchoring of the imaginary in the real, far from being the consequence of a simple logical or metaphysical requirement, is clearly established by the inner consciousness of the real ego. The imagination of fictional lives is also often motivated by one's real life and its misfortunes. In addition, the content of fantasy worlds amounts always, to some extent at least, to a modification or variation of the real world. This is why a fantasy world can reveal aspects in the real world that are usually overlooked. However, it is mainly when we imagine something that could possibly be or become real that fantasy and reality, instead of excluding or merely implicating each other, show their essential complementarity. 6, the role of imagination in the assumption of real possibilities. In the revision of the sixth logical investigation, Husserl makes a distinction between real and ideal possibilities. A possibility is real when something, usually an originary intuition, speaks for it or entices it. On this basis, a real possibility does not only relate to a possible empirical reality. Theoretical or methodological reason can also speak in favor of the assumption of the possibility of an ideal reality, for example, a non-Euclidean space. Consequently, one must make a distinction between real and imaginary possibilities for both empirical and ideal objects. I don't think Husserl does that as clearly. Ideal possibilities can thus, for both empirical and ideal objects, be unreal possibilities that one just imagines in an act of fantasy that makes no claim concerning their possible realization, or they can be irreal possibilities or possibilities a priori that are founded on a truly intuitive insight into an essence or an essential law. While the latter ideal possibilities can also be real possibilities, this is not the case for the former merely imaginary possibilities. Further, what speaks for real possibilities can be explicitly and actively grasped, or it can be passively presupposed. Finally, real possibilities can also differ in the weight with which they entice a positing assumption. The assumption of real possibilities relating to empirical things is most often motivated by the former experiences of real things, of the real world, and it is oriented towards an anticipation of future experiences of the same realities. Usually, these future experiences or events are not only assumed to be possible, but they are expected as a future reality. They belong to the horizon of a present perception, and as such can already be virtually perceived. When a present perception reaches out to the next perception of a single real object, this obviously goes far beyond the consideration of a mere real possibility. This is why Husserl distinguishes this kind of potentiality, which belongs to the horizon of expectation, from an experience this is why Husserl distinguishes this kind of potentiality, which belongs to the horizon of expectation of an experience, from a mere possibility. One can then further differentiate between potentialities that essentially relate to the nature of the objects and potentialities that are related to the subject, for instance, its habits, interests, etc. In addition, a subject that is involved in such objective and subjective potentialities not only anticipates a future experience or appearance of the object, it usually actively contributes to its realization. The anticipation of the further course of an actual perception of a real thing is not a matter of mere fantasy, but of a perception's actual potentiality. Fantasy alone can not even account for the nature of the real possibility of a real thing and its actual perception. Assumptions about really possible experiences involve a belief, a pre-predicative affirmation that is in no way neutralized. Finally, when it comes to the subject making this future experience really possible, namely to its possibilization, it goes without saying that imagination is of no use at all. Pure fantasy not only lacks belief in what it imagines, it also lacks the potentiality to make its imagined object become real. This doesn't mean, however, that possibilities related to real empirical objects do not lend themselves to acts of imagination. It only means that imagination is different from an expectation or anticipation, and that imagination alone cannot account for or justify the assumption or affirmation of a possibility, especially a real possibility. Only an original intuition can legitimate the possession of a real possibility, a sensible perception in the case of empirical objects, and an intellectual intuition in the case of ideal objects. Imagination remains, however, a privileged way to leave the mere observation of real facts behind and to explore possible events. But again, it is not imagination that makes these possible events really real. Imagination, under the form of a pure fantasy, has no concern for whether what it imagines can possibly become real. We must thus say, first, the belief or affirmation that what one imagines is really possible belongs to an act that goes beyond the content of an act of fantasy. And two, whether this subjective belief or affirmation is legitimate or not depends on an original intuitive experience and knowledge of the nature of the objects or of the real worlds, and not on imagination. 7, imagination and ideal possibilities prescribed by essences. Husserl believes that not everything we know about the real worlds comes from our empirical, intuitive experience of real facts. Real facts depend on both empirical and ideal conditions of possibility. Formulated in Husserl's language, this means that all empirical facts have an essence, and that this essence governs their ideal possibility. We must thus keep in mind our former distinction between ideal possibilities that are unreal or opposed to real possibilities, and ideal possibilities that are irreal and in agreement with a real possibility. The former are merely imaginary possibilities for the assumption of which nothing speaks. The latter are essential and necessary conditions of the possibility for both empirical and ideal objects. Regarding the latter form of ideal possibilities, Husserl further distinguishes between logical and ontological ideal conditions of possibility, and he carefully analyzes for both of them their different levels or degrees of formalization. Most important in our present context is, however, the insight that real and ideal conditions of possibility do not exclude each other. Quite to the contrary, what is really possible must also be ideally possible. An event or course of events that one imagines can thus possibly become real only when, in addition to its compatibility with the nature of empirical reality, it satisfies the rule of logical and ontological consistency. For Husserl, what he calls the essence of an empirical object cannot be grasped in the same way as we experience real empirical objects. The essence of a table, we have heard that yesterday much more clearly and much more extensively. The essence of a table remains, however, a true object for him because it has its proper kind of irreal existence and lends itself to an intuitive experience sui generis. Husserl calls this experience an intuition of essence, or an eidetic intuition. He also uses the term Wesensanschauung to emphasize that the intellectual intuition of an essence is a kind of perception, though not a straightforward one, like a sensible perception. In Husserl's final account, such an intuition of an essence is obtained by means of an eidetic variation. This is a free variation of examples that allows for the intuitive givenness of their invariant common essence. The freedom of this variation is thus geared towards a delimitation of what binds together the variable examples. In this variation, variable real empirical objects or facts are defactualized, or better, derealized, to allow for an insight into their common ideal essence. Derealized objects are empirical objects, the existence of which has been neutralized. In the operation of an eidetic variation, a manifold of different neutralized or unreal empirical objects of a certain kind becomes, for example, different tables, become variable examples or instances of one and the same real essence, the table in general. This general essence of all tables can further be formalized, and then it becomes, in its turn, a specific example of a more general essence, such as something in general. The same eidetic treatment can also be applied to predicative judgments and even to our experience of all kinds of intentional acts and objects. This is to say that in addition to ontological eidetic considerations, logical objects such as meanings and phenomenological objects such as the acts of intentional consciousness also lend themselves to an eidetic approach. Since the derealization of variable empirical objects is the first step leading to the intuition of their common essence, and since imaginary objects are by definition unreal, we are allowed to think that the imaginary objects of pure fantasy are best suited for the intuition of an essence. Equally, the free eidetic variation of derealized or imagined objects is most easily and most efficiently carried out in an act of imagination. Imagined objects lend themselves best to an imaginary variation, and imagination thus becomes, for Husserl, the royal way leading to the intuition of essences and to the formation of eidetic sciences, including phenomenology. 8. Eidetic sciences and sciences of facts. We must thus keep in mind that the intuition of an essence, while best initiated by an imaginative variation of imagined object, is not itself an act of imagination. Essences are true and not imaginary objects. They have their own kind of existence that is not unreal but irreal. Just as a sensible perception is required for the justification of a belief in the real existence of empirical objects, only an act of true eidetic intuition, and not an act of intuitive pure fantasy, can justify the ideal existence of an essence. In whatever way one may account for their existence of these essences in terms of validity, lawfulness, of region or realm, essences are neither imagined objects nor merely possible objects. Their relation to possibility rather consists in allowing for a possibility or in a lawfully prescribing the conditions of possibility. Essences not only allow for ideal possibilities concerning ideal objects, they also allow for real possibilities concerning empirical facts or real things, and real possibilities concerning an intuitively fulfilled experience of them. Yet essences can in no way help realize the possibilities they normatively prescribe. The real existence of an empirical thing or of an individual fact can never be deduced from an intellectual insight into the nature of an essence. This limitation marks a constraint, but also an opening. On the negative side, eidetic sciences can never completely substitute themselves for sciences of facts. on the positive side, eidetic sciences formulate ideal laws, the validity of which is not restricted to already existing empirical sciences. These laws also apply to novel empirical sciences, which eidetic sciences can help to bring into view or help to promote. Phenomenology as an eidetic science concerning the intentional correlation between mental events and objective phenomena does more than this. It formulates the ideal conditions of possibility for all existing empirical sciences of nature and spirit. It allows for the establishment of new transcendental phenomenology as a rigorous science, and it contributes to reformation of the already existing empirical and eidetic sciences. As an eidetic science based on the imaginary variation of mainly imagined intentional mental events, Husserl's phenomenology appeared to many, including phenomenological critics, we have heard that again yesterday, as living on the thin air of a Platonic ideal space. These critics mistook the distinction between facts and essence to indicate a radical ontological separation. However, Husserl made clear that just as all facts have an essence, all essences and eidetic sciences eventually refer back to facts. Consequently, the phenomenological, eidetic, and transcendental science of intentional consciousness cannot be said to lose all interest in the factual experience of real persons and in the existence of the real world. Husserl's phenomenology just investigates these facts with the help of imagination as real and ideal possibilities. Thank you.
We have about 13 minutes for question and answer here. Let me turn the microphone on. I think we're on now.
Professor Bernet, thank you so much for your rich talk. Every time I listen to your talks and I get the chance to meet you at conferences, I'm always in awe of the richness of your arguments. I have a couple of questions. One of them goes back to this idea of the freedom of the imagination, and you put it beautifully in terms of indifference to difference. Such an interesting way of thinking about it. My question, though, is, and goes back to this idea of motivation from life, sort of normative and existential commitments that motivate us in a sort of broader scheme. And you make a beautiful case how that actually is there in the background for the imagination. And I wonder, to what extent can we really talk about indifference and freedom from, in the imaginative context, if that background is always going to be at work? In other words, perhaps the language of purity and indifference doesn't capture the ways in which the imagination is actually much more open to what we experience in a positional attitude. That's just one thought. The other question that I have goes back to this idea of imagination as reproduction. And he gives such a rich account of this notion of the quasi, which has always troubled me, because minimally understood, as you rightly pointed out, it just points to a bracketing of doxic commitment. And that's such a poor way of understanding what is really at work in the imagination. And there's much more to it, as you rightly point out. And I really liked your focus on the marginalization idea. I think that's an interesting way of rethinking what the quasi might amount to. But I wonder if at the heart of the imagination there remains some sort of implicated, sensible type of perception, albeit imaginary. Are we not somehow restricting what the imagination is able to engage as an intentional object? In other words, are those necessarily spatially determined, even if imagined? I think it's true that imagination as reproduction, in the manner you described it, holds in a lot of cases. I wonder if it holds in all cases. There may be kinds of imaginary experiences that are not reproductive in this way.
Okay, the second question is more difficult, I think, would need more time for discussion. The freedom I think imagination is such a complex phenomenon that what I have been saying and what you are saying after having said what I said, and when you said but, is also true. So I think both statements can be defended and are true, namely that imagination is an act of freedom, of escape, and that for the better or the worse, one never quite escapes real life, and so that one can always wonder how this escape or attempt to an escape remains motivated, anchored in real life. Dreams are not good examples, not orthodox examples of imagination, but when it comes to relation of dreams and real life, I think one faces exactly the same issues. In our dreams, we escape reality. In our dreams, reality comes back in its most frightful and or happy, but mostly ignored elements. So then the other question, I think your other question is still a question of constraints and freedom. So I'm aware of that issue. So to some extent, when I was saying that once pure fantasies develop into some kind of coherent web with a corresponding fantasy world, there are clearly rules or laws of consistency that are not of an imaginary sort. So certain logical and ontological constraints that normally apply to the real world also apply to the imaginary worlds. Think of literature. Literature can give you a perfect account of a deceiving person, but the writer of a novel cannot deceive his or her reader in his or her representation of a deceiving person. So, and in this case, of course, it has to do with the communication, but already the content of a novel, if it is of any kind of interest, must fulfill certain logical and ontological constraints. And I mean, but then you were more specific, space. I must think more about that. So how much the space of imagination is different from real space, and what that would then mean for the nature of space.
So just a quick follow-up. When you were sort of describing, or you were giving the answer to my first question, perhaps another way of saying is that there's an implied quasi-act at the heart of imagining consciousness, but it need not be perceptual. It could be a higher order founded act, in which case we would be dealing, we would have an answer to the concern of, are we only dealing, for example, with acts whose objects are bound to be spatially determined or not? In this way, you would actually deal with that issue and say, you would do justice to the fact that there can be a quasi-perception at the heart of imagining and implying.
Okay, that's what you meant.
Founded higher order act. It need not be the perceptual kind, it could be something else.
Okay, creative imagination of mathematicians, for instance. Okay, yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think I'm going to kind of continue in the same vein and wonder what you think about the claim that any conceivable act whatsoever can undergo an imaginative or fantasy modification, which is something you pointed out before. And I think this is interesting because first of all, I think imagination can't be completely intuitive, because even when I imagine seeing a centaur, the centaur has imagined hidden sides. So already in imagination we have empty components, horizontal components, for instance. But then I could also insert myself in a fantasy world in which, can you hear me okay? I can imagine myself into a fantasy world where I'm being stopped by a dragon that I never see, right? So here it would never show up at all. And I think this opens up the possibility of fantasying unreal or impossible objects. So I wondered if, when we talk about imagination, we could also talk about imagining completely impossible scenarios, like me discovering the greatest prime number, or walking around an Escher sidewalk, for instance. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Not many.
Or if that's not, I'm puzzled over this too, and so I've wondered, because it seems like imagination is usually characterized as an intuitive act, but in the case of memory, right, memory can either be intuitive or it can just be signative and empty. And I think that might be true of imagination too. Fantasy is not essentially intuitive in the way that, say, image consciousness is. And it's also not a doxic quality, right? It's because it can take on any quality whatsoever. And Husserl says this at one point where he says something like, in fantasy I both believe and don't believe. I quasi-believe, right? The paradox is solved because the belief is indexed. So fantasy can't be another one of the qualities that Husserl understands. And I wondered, I think this is all consistent with everything you said. I would just...
Okay. What does one win when overstepping Husserl's characterization of fantasy as an intuitive act? And what does one lose? Can I reformulate your question in this way?
Absolutely, yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. What one loses is clearly the anchoring of imagination in ordinary perceptual experience, and therefore relating imagination with remembering and that kind of activity. What one wins is clearly what one has formerly excluded, namely the relation between imagination and thinking. This is why I was referring to mathematics, so the kind of imagination we ascribe to mathematicians. But then, again, I think one falls back on what Husserl wanted to move away from, the Brentanian background of imaginary objects we can only grasp by means of signs or symbols and this kind of things. And I mean, and there is a follow-up to that, of course, language. So the kind of imagination, at least in your question, you were interested in, clearly is much more conceptually bound than the kind of intuitive imagination I was talking about. So it's not only overstepping spatial constraints, it is also stepping into the realm of conceptual thinking in imagination.
Right.
Okay, tentative answer.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
We have literally 1 minute here, so I can get one last quick question. And go down. And of course, there'll be a lot of time to talk to Dr. Bernet later today and over dinner. No, you just
All right. I was just wondering about an artist. Said to be a successful artist, the artist has to be both a creator and a spectator at the same time.
Yeah.
You have to, let's say, you're producing a painting, put yourself in a position where you're being affected by the painting perceptually while you're creating the painting. So in other words, it's this sort of amalgam, if you might like, between fantasy and perception. Is this a special case, or where would it fall in what you would think?
I'm not sure I fully
The artist
understood.
is not simply fantasizing. The artist is also perceiving. He has to be in both positions at once, so to speak.
I didn't say it. He has to, but he can be. And what I was thinking of is again dreams, which is a good example. So you can dream something. As a dreamer, you can be a spectator of your dreams, but you can also be a participant in your own dreams, or you can change between the two positions. So it was not thinking so much of the artist and of the dreamer, but in the artist, of course. Merleau-Ponty in his course on literature refers to how Stendhal, through a kind of fictive projection of himself into the literary figures, changes his own life. So how Stendhal is both the writer and the spectator of what's happening to Fabrice, for instance, and is participating and changed by what he, in his real life, by what he imagines. So would that be a possible answer to your question or to your concern?